Hello and welcome to another video review. Today I'm going to talk about the Sony A7R Mark VI. First things first, this review is not sponsored. I don't get free cameras or early access to cameras in exchange for saying nice things about them. This is a commercial sample that I purchased, and these are basically my own opinions, and they're not influenced by any favors for manufacturers or anything like that. So the A7R Mark VI is an upgrade to the A7R Mark V, which was the previous highest resolution full frame camera that Sony had. That was a great camera. It's the camera that I'm using to record this video actually. And it performs well for many subjects as long as those subjects are relatively static. So it's not an action camera. The reason it's not an action camera basically boils down to the fact that it doesn't have a blackout-free viewfinder, so when you're shooting a burst, the viewfinder has a significant lag and it kind of looks like a slideshow. It's not real time, so it's really hard to follow action. And it also tops out at 10 frames a second. The electronic shutter on the A7R Mark V is pretty much useless for action because the readout speed is pretty slow, about 95 milliseconds. So you're going to see all kinds of distortions in the subject and the background if you're panning or something that moves fast, so it's not usable for those applications. So with the A7R Mark VI, Sony has repositioned this camera as an action-ready camera. Namely, it has blackout-free viewfinder, much like the A1 series. This is the A1 Mark II, as well as ability to shoot 30 frames a second with electronic shutter, and they've also reduced the sensor readout time. We'll talk about that later. So now it can shoot 30 frames per second RAW with autofocus, and the autofocus system customization and the software in this one is pretty much like the A1 Mark II. There are some differences that I'm going to explain later, but it inherits a lot of features from the top of the line professional A1 series, but it also retains the same high resolution as the A7R Mark V. It even increases on that slightly. It's a small difference. Basically, it tries to combine both high resolution and high speed in the same package, which is quite compelling. Having said that, the A1 series is also combining pretty much high resolution, 50 megapixels, and the highest speed available in one package. So long is gone is the time where you had to choose between speed and resolution. I remember like when I was shooting with Canon a long time ago, the 1DX series cameras were always the fastest, but they were not the highest resolution. And same with Nikon, the D850 series were the highest resolution, but if you wanted the ultimate speed, you had to use the D5 and D6 series, which are 20 megapixel cameras. But with Sony, you get the speed and the resolution in the same package, and same with other mirrorless offerings from Nikon and Canon these days. So we don't have to make that compromise, and that's great for bird photography because a lot of times the subject is far and you want the highest resolution possible. Let's just start talking about the body and the handling. This is pretty much like the A7R Mark V. The grip is slightly different. It's a little more sculpted, but other than that, there's really not much of a difference. Compared to the A1 series, this only has one custom function on the top. This one has two. The A1 also has a third custom function button on the front. This one doesn't have it, and it's also missing the dial on the left-hand side. This dial allows you to choose the continuous drive speed and a bunch of other things, the autofocus mode. On this one, you have to go to the menu, but it's pretty much the same as the A7R Mark V. One thing that it has is it has backlight buttons, so if you press this button on the top, it illuminates not all but most of the buttons on the back, so you can see them better if you're photographing in really low light. Let's talk a little bit about the viewfinder. The A7R Mark VI and the A7R Mark V, as well as the A1 series, they all use the 9.5 million dot OLED EVF. It's really 3.15 megapixels. Sony calls it dots and multiply the megapixels by 3 because it's RGB, but it's really 3.15. Quad XGA. So the base resolution of the EVF on these three cameras is the same. The A7R Mark V and Mark VI offer only two refresh rates. 60 frames a second and 120 frames a second for the EVF. A1 series also offers 240 frames a second or 240 hertz in addition to those. So the viewfinder on this one can go faster than both of A7R6 and A7R5. Now, with each of these cameras, when you go to a higher refresh rate than the baseline, which is the 60 hertz or 60 frames a second, there are some compromises. With the A1 series, what happens is that the image quality drops a little bit, and it might be visible in certain scenes, like scenes that are really dense. They have a lot of fine features, like if you're looking at like foliage and things like that from a distance, you might be able to see it. I think it was more significant in the original A1. In the A1 Mark II, it's less significant. In A7R Mark V, it is still visible, and in the A7R Mark VI, I would say it's less visible. So it's really hard to tell the resolution drop when you go from 60 hertz to 120 hertz, but there is a caveat to that. So with the A1 series cameras, Sony prioritizes the refresh rate. So when it says 60 frames a second, 60 hertz, it's always 60 hertz. When it says 120 hertz, it's always 120 hertz. With the A7R Mark VI, the resolution doesn't drop, but the frame rate does drop in certain conditions. So the camera prioritizes keeping the resolution or not decreasing the resolution as much as it is noticeable maybe on the A1 series, but the drawback is that the frame rate drops. So when it says 120 hertz or 120 frames a second, in my experience, it's not like that, and I can tell that by looking at the wing beats of certain birds, like a Foster's tern. You can kind of see temporal aliasing that indicates the viewfinder frame rate is dropping. So that is one thing that I've noticed on this, and it's a little more unfortunate because for things like birds in flight or action, you want the frame rate first. You don't want to see like sort of artifacts from like wing beats and things like that in the viewfinder, or sluggishness when you're panning. You really want it to have 120 hertz and then the best resolution possible with that. So they take two different approaches, and on the other hand, if you're not shooting something that is really fast, you're not panning really fast, the 120 hertz on this one, there is no visible resolution drop that I can see. In terms of the EVF limitations and caveats, all Sony cameras have had this caveat where you have pressed the shutter button to engage continuous focus. You will see another drop in the viewfinder resolution that is actually more significant than the difference between 60 hertz to 120 hertz for most of the cameras. So as soon as you engage the continuous focus to track something, you will notice that the EVF resolution is dropping. Notice the moire as soon as I have pressed the shutter. This is normal. This is half press. This is normal. This is half press. The resolution is dropping when I half press the shutter button. You can see that in the original A1. Again, in the A1 Mark II, it is improved. It's hard to quantify by how much because Sony doesn't disclose any of this information. So it's really hard to quantify it, but using both of the cameras in the field, this one is better than the original A1. And this one, I would say, when you engage the continuous focus, you can still see something, but it is very, very benign. So again, it's really hard to tell in most conditions that the basically the resolution or quality is dropping when the AFC is engaged. But again, the drawback is that I think this one is playing with the frame rate a little bit. So the frame rate is not always maintained at 120 frames a second. And that's really hard for me to measure because I need a special optical setup to be able to measure the viewfinder refresh rate. So it's maybe I'll do it someday, but it's not easy to do that. But using it in the field, I've noticed that overall this one prioritizes quality, lets the frame rate drop a little bit. But the A1 series, it maintains the frame rate that is advertised, but the image quality can drop a little bit more. So I would say for action, for things like birds in flight, for me, the frame rate comes first. So that is actually an advantage for the A1 series compared to the A7R Mark VI. Now, if you're shooting other things, I think the approach of keeping the resolution and minimize the quality drop may be better for you. The other thing is this one does not have 240 Hertz or 240 frames a second. So when you're shooting something really, really fast, sometimes you do need that. And the A1 series offers that, but this one doesn't. How does it compare to the A7R Mark V? Compared to A7R Mark V, the quality is better definitely, as I explained, in the 120 Hertz mode. And basically, the other one, the Mark V, doesn't have a blackout-free viewfinder when you're doing a burst. So it kind of doesn't matter if it dropped the resolution or not. It's not really usable for that application. So it's kind of a moot point to even talk about it. But this one, basically, with the blackout-free, it kind of emphasizes the quality. But the frame rate at under 20 Hertz can drop to lower values. And it's not always a consistent pattern. Sometimes I see it and I see it clearly. Sometimes it doesn't happen. So I guess it depends on the scene and other factors maybe. So that's for the viewfinder. The other thing that matters for shooting action, especially with electronic shutter, is the readout speed of the sensor. If the sensor readout is slow, you're going to see distortions in the subject itself and also in the background when you're panning. And I've measured the readout speed of these cameras. I shared that in my preview of the A7R Mark VI. You can see it on the screen. That's another significant difference between A7R Mark V, A7R Mark VI, and the A1 series. So the A7R Mark V is about 95 milliseconds, which is basically useless for shooting action and things that move quickly. The A7R 6 kind of depends on the configuration of the RAW. This camera provides 3 settings for RAW. Is the lossless compressed and HQ compressed RAW. Both of these are basically 14-bit RAW, and then it has lossy compressed RAW, which is 12-bit RAW. So the bit depth is lower. And for 14-bit either lossless compressed or HQ compressed, the readout speed is about 19.6 to 20 milliseconds. Which is actually not really fast enough for action. To be honest, 20 milliseconds is kind of past the borderline of seeing a lot of artifacts and things like that. So I would say, unfortunately, that is a very unfortunate decision, and it's just not fast enough. But if you go to compressed RAW, lossy compressed RAW, which you have to do if you want to shoot at 30 frames a second, that's the case with the A1 Mark II as well. If you want to shoot 30 frames a second, then it improves to 14.5 milliseconds. And if you want to compare that with the A1 Mark II, which is below 4 milliseconds, there is a significant difference there, 3.5 times. It's not just a little bit. And whether it shows in the photographing in the real field or not, that's what I wanted to figure out, and that's why it took me a while to publish this review. So I've shot a variety of birds with this camera, and in terms of distortion in the wings for different birds, fortunately that's pretty rare, and it only happens for certain birds. For example, the highest probabilities when photographing hummingbirds, it is possible and sometimes likely that you will have frames that show distortions in the wing. And if you really want to shoot hummingbirds, I don't recommend this camera, because you're rolling a dice and your best shot may be the one that has the wing distortion. You have to delete it. So basically, if you want to shoot hummingbirds all the time, forget about this. Just go with the A1, and that will be the best camera for that purpose. Other than hummingbirds, it can happen for songbirds, especially when taking off. Like this example that you see right now, the forewing is it looks a little goofy. So this one is pretty rare. So you have to shoot like thousands of frames and look hard to find an example where the wings are distorted. So anything other than hummingbirds, from the species that I'm aware of, there might be some other exotic bird somewhere that flaps really fast. that I'm not aware of, but just common species. Hummingbird is the one that this camera might struggle with. The rest of them, it's going to be fine in terms of distortion for the bird, in the bird itself. Now, distortion in the background is a different topic. The problem is that when you're panning at a very long focal length and you're panning rapidly, the features in the background are going to get distorted because of that relatively slow readout speed. You can see an example on the screen now, and this happens pretty much every time. If you're panning, I would say with 600 millimeters and longer, you're panning quickly and you have a man-made feature in the background like vertical lines and things like that, it's likely that you will see distortions in there. It's just basically pure mathematics. You can do the math and basically find out what is the slant angle of the distortion in the background relative to your panning speed and focal length and all that. If you want to shoot things with man-made backgrounds that have perfectly vertical features, again, forget about this camera. You're going to have problems with it. It's not going to work very well, unfortunately. Then you just have to use the A1 series or the A9 series. But if you're photographing birds in flight and birds and natural subjects, you don't want man-made stuff in the background. It's very unusual to want to have like buildings or fences and things. They just don't make a great photograph anyway. So nobody usually photographs like that. You want like natural background, and typically you want a nice autofocus soft background that makes the subject pop. In those circumstances, it's very hard to see the distortion, but there are circumstances where the autofocus features in the background, let's say you have some trees or some other features that do have a structure to them, like trees that are vertical, or if you're photographing on the beach, you might have like in the background shells and things like that that are circular. When they're out of focus, sometimes they get distorted as you're panning, and you can see it in the image. If you didn't know that the camera had this problem, it would have been less likely for you to notice it, but once you know that the camera has this limitation and you start looking, you will find more and more of them. So overall, this distortion in the background, whether it's a problem or not, really boils down to what you want out of your camera. What are your goals? If you're just photographing general bird in flight, you know, you have different kinds of species, you photograph in different conditions, especially if you're just learning, if you're just stepping into it, if you're just trying more like an adventure, it's unlikely that you will get bitten by these distortions, because most likely you will try different backgrounds, you will have different opportunities, and not all of them will have something in the background that would show the distortion. But if you are after that like 0.1% of the shots where you want everything to be perfect, you are going on a specific trip for photographing an exotic species, that's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, or you already have a portfolio, extensive portfolio of photographs, and you're after certain photographs only, then unfortunately I wouldn't recommend this camera for it, just because you can get bitten by the distortion. In that one shot that you worked so hard with, there might be something in the background that would just make the distortion obvious for that particular shot. And of course you can do post-processing and all that, but that's a slippery slope. That's not to, my opinion, at least, if you go and use, for example, AI to like swap your background, that's no longer a photograph taken with your camera. That's just another kind of, it is still art, but it's a different kind of art. It's like AI creation. It's not a photograph to me. So if you're like that, I would suggest that you skip this and just go for an A1 series. And this may be a little controversial, but it is my opinion. I don't really care what the manufacturer might say about how capable this is. It's just basically, in this case, pure mathematics, and it's not like a subjective thing. This is 4 milliseconds. This is best case 13.5 milliseconds, and so it is what it is. Again, you may find it acceptable for what you want to do, but if you want really after that 1 percentile, like really top frames, and you can't afford to miss, then this is not your camera. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the autofocus. Before we talk about comparing the autofocus performance, I wanted to mention a few things because you may see different results or hear different opinions. You often see like some images posted on the internet or shown a video as proof to the autofocus working great. But I would say that that's actually not a proof of anything, because unless you see the raw file, you can't really tell whether the focus was tack sharp on target or the focus could have been a little bit soft. With the tools we have these days, post-processing, especially when dealing with like a 50 or 60 megapixel file, you can crop it and then downsample it and sharpen it, and it will look great, even if the raw file was not quite in focus. So when you see like a sequence of images and 100% looks tack sharp, that's probably not the case if you look at the raw. So be a little bit careful with what you look at and what conclusions you're making from those, because yeah, if it's totally out of focus, like the focus is on the background or something, it doesn't matter if you shrink it or what, it'll be obvious. But with these kind of cameras, we're talking about focus being tack sharp right on the head, and for example not on the wing or not on the tail. Those kinds of differences is hard to tell when the image is post-processed and downsampled, and you know, even if you have like 3,000 pixel image, the original is like 10,000 pixels wide. So when you downsample and sharpen it, it will change and it will look great, what the raw may not have been. So without seeing the raw, we cannot make any conclusion. The other one is testing the autofocus to measure it quantitatively. It's almost an impossible task, especially for something like birds in flight, because these are live animals. They do whatever they want to do, and they're not going to do the same thing twice. They're not going to go, like a falcon is not going to go to the same position, wait for you to set up and come at you at exactly the same trajectory and the same speed for you to test that out and see which camera is better. So things are always different in the field, so that makes like a controlled experiment almost impossible. So we kind of have to rely on experience, ideally with the same subject at the same location with the same conditions, to kind of make a call on autofocus. And any camera can make sharp pictures of even really tough subjects. In fact, I have like photographs that I took more than a decade ago with the Canon 1D series back then, and that camera is a joke compared to either one of these in terms of autofocus. But I have some like really impressive frames taken with that camera, many of such frames. So if I posted that, what does it prove? It doesn't prove anything about the autofocus capability of that camera. It just proves that I was able to get that shot, maybe because I used the right technique and right method, and I had quite a bit of experience doing it. So that's the only thing that it proves. So again, showing like sharp samples of, look, I got this shot with the A7R Mark VI, it's the best camera because I got this shot, that really doesn't mean anything. The only way we can really compare it to something like the A1 series or the A9 series, to use it in the field for a while and get a feeling of like, okay, what was the keeper rate in a similar situation? That can qualitatively, not quantitatively, tell us the relative autofocus performance of these two cameras. Now, the only thing that is quantitative about the difference between these two is the autofocus computation bandwidth. So the A1 Mark II and the A9 Mark III, and I believe the original A1, they perform 120 autofocus cycles per second. What does that mean? That means the camera basically assesses the scene, finds the subject, assesses and computes the subject distance, and then drives the lens to that position 120 times a second. So basically, it's the speed of the autofocus tracking loop, or the sample rate of the autofocus tracking loop, 120 cycles per second. The A7R Mark VI can only do 60. If you go to the highest raw configuration for like 14-bit lossless, it drops to 30. But for lossy compressed, it does 60 cycles a second compared to 120. So the autofocus tracking loop bandwidth is half as much as the A1 series. And what does that mean in practice? The tracking loop sample rate or speed is critical when a subject is changing its distance really rapidly. That usually happens when the bird is coming towards you, because if it's flying parallel to the back of the camera or at a shallow angle, the focus distance doesn't change much. So I've shot a variety of species with these two cameras, fast and small birds like swallows, least terns coming at you, and other birds such as peregrine falcon flying really fast, coming towards you. And I would say in cases where the bird is coming at you, that's where you see the difference. So what is the keeper ratio difference? The keeper ratio difference is not a factor of 2 between them. As I mentioned, when the bird is flying parallel to the camera and at a shallow angle, the keeper rate is the same. When it's coming towards you, depending on the conditions, how fast the bird is going, what is the background, on all of those, the keeper ratio of the A1 Mark II can be about 20 to 30%, and in some cases even 40%, give or take, more than the A7R Mark VI. Is that a significant difference between the two? I would say not as much as the difference in the readout speed, because they're both shooting at 30 frames a second, so they both get sharp shots. At 30 frames a second, if you're like following the subject for like 2 seconds, you get 60 shots. So let's say this one has a keeper ratio of 70% and this one has a keeper ratio of 60% or 55%. They both have plenty of sharp shots. Again, if you're after one very specific frame, you want to maximize your keeper ratio, then again, this is your camera. You got to get this. But overall, it's not like you go with this and you're going to have a significant problem. It's different than the distortion in the background, where when it happens, there's no solution. There's nothing you can do about it. But with the autofocus, when the bird is coming right at you at high speed, you just have to keep in mind that it doesn't perform as well as the A1 Mark II. But it doesn't perform poorly at all. It performs pretty good. It's just not at the same level. And the root cause of that, again, is just basically math. This is 120 cycles a second. This is 60 cycles a second. So that is the reason why this camera costs less than the A1 series, is the computation bandwidth is just not as high as that. So that's something to keep in mind. But then again, if there was no other difference between these two cameras and only the autofocus would be different for incoming subjects, I would still recommend this without any reservation for birds in flight. But because of that slow readout speed and those distortions in the background, that's the main reason I have reservations about this camera. The autofocus performance of this camera for its price relative to this is perfectly reasonable. This is $7,000, this is $4,500, $2,500, and the autofocus is a little bit worse, but only when the subject is coming towards you at speed. So it's a very specific condition, and the difference is not day and night. So now that we talked about the autofocus, let's talk a little bit about the image quality. There isn't actually a whole lot to talk about. That's where it performs as expected, which is the best overall image quality of any Sony full-frame camera available today. So with this one, it also has mechanical shutter that gives you a little bit more dynamic range. So for those landscape shots, you can set it to mechanical shutter, and you can take advantage of the large dynamic range and really clean low ISO images. You can use all that 65 megapixel high quality files, and really nothing comes close to this when you look at a landscape shot that is exposed properly with the highest dynamic range and everything. It's like really nice and really pleasing to look at the images, just like the A7R Mark V. It really excels for that. And then with electronic shutter, the dynamic range is a little bit lower. There are measurements online, so I don't need to measure that. Other people have already done it. And for high ISO, which is what we use for birds in flight, most of the time I use ISO 400, 800, 1600. These are the three ISOs that I use most, and between those I probably use 800 most. The image quality is pretty good. It's the same kind of quality as the A1 Mark II, except for this one's got more megapixels. One thing to note is that this has 33% more megapixels, but resolution is basically square root of the megapixels, because it's a linear term. It's both X and Y, 2 dimensions. So The real resolution increase is only 15%, not 33%. So you get 15% more resolution with more or less the same quality. And does that make a difference? Not really, but sometimes when you want to crop tight, this one is just a little bit better. But I would say that's like a very small factor between the two. It's not a deciding factor. Now that this is 65, I'll take it, so that's great. But if it weren't, that would not be a deciding factor anyway. Overall, this camera is a pretty good camera, especially for the price. If you think about it, we don't even need to compare this with the A7R Mark V, because that camera was, I believe, about $3,500 when it first came out. With the inflation and everything, if you adjust the price, $4,500 is not a bad price at all. But if we compare this with the 1DX, the 1DX was about, I believe, $6,000 or $6,500 in 2012, so more than a decade ago. And $6,000 today would be, I don't know how much, probably like 10,000 or maybe more in today's money. And this camera is orders of magnitude better than that camera. So Moore's law is still true, technology advances, and with the same money we're getting a lot more bang for our bucks. So this follows that trend. It's a pretty good camera in 2026 for the money, but it is not flawless. As I mentioned, the readout time is the Achilles heel of this camera for certain types of action shots, and that is really ultimately what limits it. For birds in flight photography, that is something that you have to keep in mind. And like I said, if you just want to get into it, it's your first camera that you want to photograph birds in flight, you want to experiment things, you want to try different species, different backgrounds, it is a great camera and you'll be happy with it. But if you are a seasoned photographer that already has done like adventurous stuff and has an extensive portfolio, and you're after certain shots, you must get the perfect shot and you don't want to miss that, then I wouldn't recommend this. I would recommend the A1 series for that purpose, because it is still the best camera for that particular purpose. Another thing I want to discuss is that although this is a great camera in Sony's world, we also have to take a look at the competition from both Nikon and Canon. And that's where, again, that readout speed is a little bit of a disappointment there. So what is my final verdict? Would I recommend this camera for birds in flight? I think it's a great camera, it's a capable camera, but it does have a notable limitation, which is the slow readout speed that can manifest itself in distortions in the subject itself if you're shooting something like a hummingbird, and also in the background. And the background one is more significant than the subject itself. With man-made backgrounds, it's pretty obvious. With natural backgrounds that are autofocus, it's less noticeable, but there are some images, even with natural background, where you can see it. It can come to bite you, and there's nothing you can do about it. So that is the reservation I have about this camera. Its autofocus performance is not the same levels as the A1 Mark II, but it is certainly adequate and good enough. So with that, I want to thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for the next video. And by the way, if you have this camera or the A1 series or the A9 III series, you may want to check my video guide that I explain how to set up these cameras for birds in flight photography to get the most out of them. See you next time.